The air in the box canyon tasted of dust, cheap whiskey, and desperation. It was a place where honor went to die, traded for coin or a jug. Ishani stood on a platform of warped planks, her hands bound loosely with rawhide. It was an insult, that looseness. It meant they didn't see her as a threat, just a commodity. She made sure every man who looked her way understood how wrong they were. Her gaze was not pleading. It was a weapon, honed sharp by generations of warriors who had stared down the sun itself. She met the eyes of a grimy trapper with a missing tooth and held them until he flinched, looking away as if he'd touched a hot skillet. She dissected a portly merchant, his soft hands and softer belly, and saw the rot of greed in him. He shuffled his feet and found a sudden interest in a mule tethered nearby. They saw a woman. She made them see a reckoning. She was Ndi of the Chiricahua. Her name was a song her grandmother had given her, a name she would not let these men speak. Days ago, she had been tracking a mountain lion that had stolen a foal. A flash of metal, the crack of a rifle butt against her skull, and she had woken up here. A prisoner, but not a victim. Never a victim. Her pride was the one thing they could not bind. Then she saw him. He was different from the others. Leaner, quieter, with the kind of stillness that comes from long days spent under an empty sky. His hat was battered, his clothes worn thin at the knees and elbows, but there was a clean line to his jaw. He wasn't looking at her body, like the others. He was looking at her eyes. For a long moment, their gazes locked across the squalid clearing. He saw the fire. She saw nothing. He was a blank page, and that was more dangerous than the open lechery of the others. Caleb hadn't come for this. He'd ridden 2 days for salt, cartridges, and maybe a bag of flour if his credit held. The illegal exchange at Verde Creek was a necessary evil, a place to get what the territorial towns wouldn't sell without asking questions. He kept his head down and his business quiet. But then he saw the woman on the block, and the quiet inside him curdled. It wasn't her beauty that struck him, though she was shaped by the hard grace of the mountains themselves. It was the sheer, unbending force of her will. She was a captured eagle, and these men were crows pecking at her cage. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Silas, was losing his patience. Strong back, good teeth. Who'll start the bidding? Silence. Ishani's glare swept the crowd, a promise of future vengeance. Caleb felt his hand move before his brain gave the order. He stepped forward. The dust puffed around his worn boots. He didn't look at the woman again. He looked at Silas. How much? Caleb's voice was rough from disuse. Silas blinked, surprised. To start, say $50. Caleb didn't bargain. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his belt. He upended it onto a barrelhead. Gold eagles, silver dollars, the entire profit from a season of breaking wild horses, rolled and settled in the dust. It was everything he had. That do it? A murmur went through the small crowd. Silas's eyes widened. He licked his lips and scooped the coins up greedily. Sold, to the quiet man. Caleb walked to the platform. He ignored Silas's offered hand. He pulled his knife, a simple, clean tool, and sliced the rawhide binding Ishani's wrists. He didn't touch her skin. He stepped back, gesturing with his head toward the canyon mouth. He didn't say a word. She followed him, her steps measured, her back straight as a pine. The eyes of every man in the canyon were on them, a mixture of confusion and resentment. Once they were clear of the trading post, hidden by the curve of the red rock walls, Caleb stopped. He turned to his horse, a sturdy buckskin that had carried him 1,000 miles, and He checked the canteen, ensuring it was full. He patted the saddlebag, feeling the weight of the jerky and hardtack inside. Then he took the reins and held them out to her. Ishani stared at the leather strips in his hand. She looked from the reins to his face. Her expression was unreadable, carved from stone. "The dragoons are that way," he said, pointing east with his chin. "Should be water at the base of the peaks." He met her eyes again and for the first time spoke to her as a person. "Go." He turned his back on her, on his horse, on everything he owned, and began the long walk north. He didn't look back. An honorable man doesn't watch to see if his good deed is appreciated. He just does the deed. 3 days later, the sun was a hammer, and the earth was an anvil. Caleb was rationing the last of the water in a small flask he'd kept on his belt. His boots were scuffed to ruin, and his world had shrunk to the next step, and the one after that. He had no illusions. No, a man on foot in this country was a dead man taking his time. He'd made his choice back in the canyon. He'd live with it for as long as he had left. He heard it first, the soft thud of hooves in the sand. He stopped, turning slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. A lone rider was silhouetted against the blinding glare of the afternoon. As the figure drew closer, the shape became familiar. The buckskin horse, and the woman riding it. She wasn't the same woman he'd left at the canyon mouth. The fear and fury in her eyes had been banked, replaced by a cool, assessing calm. She wore a deerskin tunic now, and a rifle rested in the crook of her arm as if it had grown there. She rode not like someone fleeing, but like someone who owned the horizon. She reined the horse to a halt a dozen feet away, circling him once, her gaze taking in his sun-cracked lips, his dusty clothes, the exhaustion etched into his posture. He stood his ground, waiting. Finally, she spoke. Finally. Her English was clipped, precise. Why? It was not a question of gratitude. It was a demand for an accounting. Caleb considered a long answer, something about right and wrong, about decency. But that wasn't his way. He gestured vaguely back in the direction of the canyon. It was wrong. She watched his face, searching for a lie, for some hidden motive, lust, or desire for a reward. She found none. She saw only a simple truth, stated as plainly as the rocks around them. She dismounted, pulling a waterskin from the saddle. She held it out. He took it, drank deeply, and handed it back. A transaction, simple and clean. "The men who took me," she said, her eyes on the distant mountains. "They are called slavers, coyotes. They will not be happy you cost them their price." "Reckon not," Caleb agreed. "They will track you," she stated. It was not a warning. It was a fact. Let 'em. That night, they made a small camp in a wash, the fire no bigger than a man's hat. She had snared 2 rabbits with an expert silence, and they roasted them over the coals. She ate with a hunter's focus. He ate like a man who hadn't seen real food in days. The silence between them was vast, but it had changed. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but of observation. The attack came just after the moon rose, a sliver of bone in the black sky. 3 shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness of the canyon walls. The crack of a twig was their only announcement. Caleb was on his feet, pistol in hand, before the first shadow took its 3rd step. A rifle boomed from the darkness near him, and one of the attackers grunted and fell. Ishani. She had moved away from the firelight, becoming one with the night. A bullet whined past Caleb's ear. He fired back at the muzzle flash, a prayer sent into the dark. He heard a curse. He dropped and rolled, as another shot tore through the space where he'd been standing. These weren't clumsy bandits. They were professionals. He saw the third man, a hulking shape with a knife, rushing him from the side. Caleb didn't have time to aim. He threw himself forward, crashing into the man's legs. They went down in a tangle of limbs, dust, and grunts of pain. The man was stronger, his hands closing around Caleb's throat. Caleb's vision began to star and fade. Then, a blur of motion. Ishani was there. She moved with a fluid lethality that was both terrifying and beautiful. Her knife flashed once, twice. The hands on Caleb's throat went limp. The heavy body slumped over him. He pushed the man off, gasping for air. The second man, the one he'd shot at, was trying to crawl away, clutching a wounded leg. Ishani walked to him, her steps silent. She looked down at him, her face impassive in the moonlight. She said something in her own tongue, the words sharp and final. Then she used her rifle butt to end his struggle. The wash was silent again, save for the whisper of the wind and Caleb's ragged breathing. 3 bodies lay cooling in the dust. Ishani came back to the fire. She wiped her knife clean on the shirt of the man she had killed and slid it back into its sheath. She looked at Caleb, who was getting to his feet, checking his pistol. He wasn't shaken, just grimly focused. He had done what was necessary. So had she. He met her gaze. "You all right?" he asked. She gave a single, curt nod. Her eyes scanned him, looking for injury. She saw none. A flicker of something new entered her expression. It wasn't softness. It was respect. "You fight like a man," she said. "Not a dog who barks at shadows." Coming from her, it felt like a medal. The tension between them had not vanished, but it had transformed. The invisible wall of culture and suspicion had been breached, brought down by shared violence and mutual survival. She had tested him, and he had not been found wanting. He had seen her not as a savage or a woman to be protected, but as a capable ally. That, more than anything, was the turning point. They traveled together for another day, moving north. The buckskin horse carried their meager supplies. They walked side by side, the rhythm of their steps falling into sync. He learned her name was Ishani. She learned his was Caleb. Words were sparse, but no longer needed to fill the space between them. By the afternoon of the second day, they reached a crossroads of sorts. A barely there trail branched west toward the flatlands where Caleb's small homestead lay, a sod-roofed cabin and a broken-down corral. The main path continued north, toward the high country, toward the lands of the Onda. This was the place of parting. Caleb stopped. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat. "My way's west," he said, his voice flat. He expected her to mount the horse, give him a nod, and ride out of his life. The debt, as he saw it, was paid in blood and smoke back in the wash. Ishani looked west at the shimmering heat haze rising from the plains. Then she looked north, to the cool, dark peaks of the mountains that were her home. Her face was a mask of contemplation. She looked at the horse, then back at Caleb. Her eyes held his, and in them he saw a decision being forged. She did not mount the horse. Instead, she took the water